Welcome to Clarke Tech. This recording is all about a commonly searched PHP topic, and that is dates. So if you want to know how to compare dates, how to format dates, how to calculate the difference between dates, or how to handle different time zones, it's your lucky day. Before we get started, let me inform you that I record in high resolution, so don't watch on a blurry screen. Choose high definition if that works for you. Would you like to join a growing group of PHP developers and take your skills to a new level? If that sounds like you, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon, and welcome. So I'll start off by creating a file where we can play around with things, and I'm just going to create a PHP file called DateTime.php. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the Symfony var dumper, because for this one I feel I'm probably going to be dumping quite a few things out, different variables and things, just to show you how these classes work. With that installed, I'm just going to require once the autoloader so that I've got access to the var dumper. And then what we'll do is we'll make a start on the DateTime class. Very easy to create a DateTime object. All we do is this. So I'll create a variable which I'll call DateTime, and it's simply new DateTime. And that is it. It does take optional arguments, but will not pass any in. We'll go and have a look at the class and I'll explain things to you. So as it says, it's a representation of date and time. So we're creating objects out of date and time, which is pretty cool. And the optional arguments are a DateTime string, which defaults to now, and also a DateTime zone, which we'll cover shortly. Let's dump this out in the console and see what it looks like. There we have it. So probably won't mean much to you. It's a DateTime class. The numbers in blue are actually the Unix time. The biggest benefit of using DateTime objects is they have so many useful functions which you'll use all the time to perform lots of really handy things. One of the most common is format, so this will take your object and convert it into a string in the format of your choice. So here we're going for years, months and days. Let's have a look at the format function. So as you can see, it returns a string. And so let's dump this out and see what we get. And there we go, that's the current date. So at the time of recording, 15th of April 2021. So like I say, the optional arguments, the first one is a DateTime string, which defaults to now, but you can pass in your own. So what I'll do, I'll pass in a different date using YMD format now. There are many different formats it takes, and I'll explain some of those as we go along. So as you can see, the date has now been changed to the one that I've passed in. If you recall the string to time function in the previous recording, we can also do stuff like that where we pass in a human readable date and it will parse that and convert it to a DateTime object also. So here's where you can read about the supported date and time formats. All you need to do is just click on these links and it'll take you and show you the different things that you can use. And here's the page where you can check out the relative formats as in the example which we've just used. Here's something else which is pretty cool. So the DateTime class implements the DateTime interface, and that has a bunch of constants, and those constants are set to commonly used formats. So always worth checking these out. The answer that you're looking for might have already been done for you. Let's go and dump one out and have a look at it. That's all good, pretty straightforward. The next thing I want to talk about is comparisons. You can take two DateTime objects and compare them against the other. Is one greater than the other, i.e. is one date time after the other date time? The way we've created our date times up to now has been by doing this, but there's actually a helper method which will do this for us, and it's date_create. And so it takes the same two optional arguments as the DateTime class. Let's go and have a look at it. So as you can see, it's going to return a DateTime. Here are the arguments. So they both default to null, DateTime string and the DateTime zone, which we'll come on and cover shortly. I'm going to pass in a string saying today, just to be explicit and make it clear what's going on. and then I'll create another date for next week. Again, for that I can use a human readable string, and then once I've done that, we'll just go and dump it out and see what we get for next week. And so it's given me a date of the 19th, so a little gotcha there. It's not actually added on a week, that's actually the next Monday. Okay, so to check if next week is after today, we check if next week is greater than today. So the way I remember it is I say greater means later, which obviously it rhymes, and it's just an easy way for me to remember it. And the answer is true. Next week is greater than today. So just to be thorough, we'll try out a couple more. We'll see if next week is equal to today. Are they the same date, in other words, which is false, obviously. And then we'll see if next week is before or is less than today. Obviously, that is false also. Now I'll show you how you can tell PHP to create you a DateTime object using a string in a given format. So what does that mean? I'll set a variable. Then we don't have a DateTime object yet, so we can call a static method called createFromFormat on the DateTime class. Remember, static methods mean that you don't need to have an object instance of the class. You can call them straight on the class. And first we pass in the format, so we're saying I'm going to give you a string and it's going to be in this format, and then you pass the string. PHP or the DateTime class will then take that information and go away and create you a DateTime object out of it. So let's dump this out and I'll show you what I mean. So we're expecting a DateTime object with the date of 21st of January 2010. Perfect. Another common method which you'll use all the time is the diff method. And what this does is it calculates the difference between two dates, otherwise known as the interval. So what I'll do is I'll create two dates, one in the past and also the present. For this I'll select the 31st of January 31st of December 1999, and I'll just comment this bit out. And then for the present I use the same dateCreate method, but I'm just not going to pass any arguments to it and it'll default to now. The way that the diff method works is you take one DateTime object, you use it to call the diff method, and into that diff method you pass your other DateTime object which you want to not compare against but find the difference between. It then returns an instance of a class called DateInterval. So let me dump that out and I'll show you what that looks like. And this is the DateInterval. And so it has a handful of properties here. Should be able to guess them. So Y is years, M months, D days, hours, minutes, seconds. So that's the amount of time between the first date and the second date. And this one at the bottom here is the total number of days between the two dates, which can come in handy, and I'll demonstrate that in a second. So let's dump out some of these properties just to have a look at them. So we'll do Y first, which is years, so 21 years, and then the days one, which I told you about. So a total of 7,776 days. So let me dump out interval again, because there's another property which is quite interesting that I'd like to show you, and that is invert. So this will tell you if you're looking backwards or looking forward in time. So what does that mean? Well, when I did past diff present, the answer was 0, meaning false, as in we're looking forward in time. But if I do present diff past, we're actually looking back in time, and so in that case invert is set to 1, which means true. So why does this matter, I hear you ask? Well, the reason it matters is because no matter which way you do this, present diff past or past diff present, if you see when I dump out the properties, for example year, present diff past, I get 21. If I change that to past diff present, I also get 21. So we don't know if we're adding years or taking years away. Let's figure out how we can write our code to indicate whether we're adding years or taking them away. So first off, I'll set years to interval y, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if interval invert, i.e. is invert true or false. So I can do that by saying if interval invert, and then if so, it means I'm taking years away. So instead of setting years to interval y, I'm going to set years to negative interval y. So let's go and dump out years, and then we'll test this in the console. So I'm doing past diff present, so I expect this to be 21. Okay, good. And then if I change this to present diff past, then hopefully we should get negative 21 in the terminal. Perfect. So that's pretty good. There's also another way you can do this by calling the format method on the interval. So I'll show you what I mean by that. And what we do is we use %r, which will mean it'll show a negative sign if the answer is negative, and it just won't show any sign if the answer is positive. So we'll do years again. Let's go and check this out. And there you go, minus 21. So you'll notice though that it was formatted as a string. If we want to keep it as an integer, we can just cast it as an integer like this. Let's check that out. And back to how we were, minus 21 as an integer. Much like the helpful dateCreate function, we also have a built-in dateDiff function, which just takes two arguments, which will be the first date and the second date. So let's give that a go, and we'll try and get the same result or the same interval as what we did by calling diff on our DateTime objects. Here's the method date_diff, and we'll pass in present as the first argument and past as the second argument. Let's dump out the interval. Our invert should be 1, and it is, so we've got 21 years, 3 months, everything exactly the same as what we got when we did it the other way around. Here's a little example of how we can create a string out of the interval. And so 21 years, 3 months and 15 days. And so up to now, the date interval has been returned from function and method calls, but it's a class like any other class, so we can just new one up ourselves. What is quite quirky is the argument that you pass into the date interval. So what I'm doing here is the P means period, and then it's 21Y, 21 years, 3M, 3 months, 15D, 15 days. So we'll dump that out, and hopefully it'll look exactly the same as what's been returned from our function calls up to now. And there we go, exactly the same, 21 years, 3 months, 15 days. So now that we've physically created that interval ourselves, let's try something pretty cool. Let's take our past date time and reverse engineer this by adding the interval onto that. It should give us the present date. So we can add intervals by calling the add method on the DateTime object. You pass in the interval. What I'm going to do is I shall dump out this DateTime and I'll format it in years, months, days, and hopefully we should get 2021-04-15. Over to the terminal, run this, and there we go, 2021-04-15. So that's how to add time. Let me show you how to subtract time. First of all, I'm just going to add 3 days onto the present date, and then we're going to look at ways of which we can subtract those 3 days. So P3D, period 3 days, and then I'm going to take the present date, and I'll add that interval, so present add plus 3 days, and then we'll dump this out and go and have a look at this. And we'll do it in years, months and days formats as per usual. And so it's added 3 days, 2021-04-18. If I wanted to take 3 days off, you can't just put a negative here. That's just going to throw an exception like so. What we can use is the sister method of add, which of course is sub. So present sub the 3 days, and then when we try this, we get April the 12th. Another way to do this, of course, is we can leave it as add, but we can invert the interval by setting it to 1. So plus 3 days invert equals 1, and hopefully this should give us April the 12th as well, because we're taking 3 days away still because it's inverted. Another thing, like the dateCreate function and also like the string to time function, we can create an interval using human readable text. There's a static method on the DateInterval, which is called create from datestring, and there's also a helper function like the dateCreate function. And so in this, you just pass in some human readable text. So I'm going to say plus 3 days. One thing to watch out for using this method is it won't give you back the same level as information as if you called the diff method of a date object. Let me show you what I mean by that. So we'll go and dump this out into the terminal. And literally the only information it gives you is the 3 for D. If we look at the other properties, none of them are all set to 0 or false. Let's change this to negative, and I'll show you the same thing for that. And so again, we don't have a value for invert. You'd think that would be 1, but in fact what it does, it just sets D to -3. So be careful with that one. Before we move on, let me show you one last way of achieving pretty much the same thing with an existing DateTime object. It has a method called modify. Now, instead of modify taking an interval or a date interval object, what it does, it just takes a string, like when we use string to time or like when we use the DateTime constructor. So I'm saying -5 days, and so it knocks off 5 days, 10th of April. So let's have a quick look at these methods. So as you can see, modify takes a string. If we look at the one below it, add takes a date interval. So I'll be clear on this. Let's have a look at sub also. So we'll check that out. That takes a date interval. So various ways of achieving the same thing there. Let's move on to something called DateTimeImmutable. So very similar to DateTime, except you can't actually change it once it's set. If you do try and change it, what you get back is a new instance of a different DateTime. So let me start off by illustrating why we might want to use an immutable DateTime. Immutable basically means that it can't be changed, it can't be mutated. So I'm going to start off by using a normal DateTime, which I set to the 1st of the 1st, 2021, and I want to keep that, so I store it in a start variable, and then I add 3 days onto that and store that in a finish variable. So we'll go and dump out our finish, and as you can see, 3 days have been added onto it, so it's 4th of the 1st, 2021. Let's have a look at start. And as you can see, 3 days have been added onto that, which might not be what we want. Like I say, I wanted to preserve that date time as 2021-01-01. The way I avoid this is by using a DateTimeImmutable. So that means it cannot be changed. And when I use methods like add or subtract, instead of altering the DateTimeImmutable, they just return a new DateTimeImmutable. So finish will be a different DateTimeImmutable object than start. I can think of one pretty good usage of DateTimeImmutable. Recently I was working on a password resets video for my Symfony Framework series, and the password resets request used DateTimeImmutable because it gives the user just a fixed window of time in order to reset their password for security reasons. And so you don't want to make it possible for that date time to be changed. Let's finish off with Timezone. When you create a DateTime object, you can actually specify a different time zone to the default, and you do that using the DateTimeZone class. So here I'm setting mine to Africa, Bamako. Please let me know if I pronounce that wrong. And we're just going to compare that against UTC. So I'll give these different variable names so we can differentiate one from the other, and then we'll just go and check them out in the terminal. and those look to be exactly the same. So not a great example. Let's try a different location. I'll start with C. So cheetah, chitta. Again, if you know how to pronounce that, then please let me know. And if you're from there, then say hi. And so we'll go and dump this out. Hopefully these will be different. I'm pretty sure they will be. And as you can see, cheetah is several hours ahead of UTC. If you've enjoyed learning this stuff and you want to put it to practical use, or indeed if you just want to learn more about dates, then check out my course where I use various date time and date interval properties and methods to calculate things like how old a user account is, display a user's local time, and to combine created at and updated at values to see if a user account is still active. So these are all fairly realistic examples of how we'd use date calculations in a real application, and I guarantee you'll love it. So check it out. The course details are in the discussion down below. And finally, if you just want YouTube to show you more of my stuff, then all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new material every few days, and details of my schedule can be found on the community tab of my YouTube channel homepage.